Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined by the nefarious Nemesis himself, Dr. Philip Chase. Hello, Philip.
Hello, Mr. AP. How are you today? It's good to be
Mr.
here.
AP, did you just demote me?
I mean, in a very affectionate way, yes.
Yeah, see, proof that you are an evil Nemesis.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I don't know if anyone needed any more proof, but there it is.
So
So,
the reason we are chatting today, you'd come up with this idea that we would do a series of videos about steps and concepts that people can use to become better readers, to become more critical readers, to be
right.
aware of what goes on in literature as a a thing that people can refer to if they want to develop their reading skills further.
Yeah.
And we were going to start today with basically narrative, story, and plot, and some of the distinctions between these different terms that we often in informal conversation use interchangeably. But, as it is with having specific terms, they can actually mean very different things. And being aware of that, it's not necessary that, we sort of go, well, that's not the definition. It's being aware of the concepts allows us to think about the narrative and the media that we are consuming and pick it apart and think about it in different ways. And if we're able to do that, we quite often can get more out of it. We garner more appreciation of the text. And that's why, both of us teach literary appreciation. It's not about, oh yeah, literature is great, rah, rah, rah. Appreciation in the meaning of understanding.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. And my hope is that this will be useful to folks who want to bring a little more analysis to their appreciation of the stories that they're engaging with. And both of us think it's wonderful to read just for pure enjoyment, for entertainment. There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. But these are tools that we have learned about over the years and that we teach in our classes that have enriched our experience with stories in ways that we want to share with people. So understanding the difference between plot and story and narrative may help you to appreciate what you're reading even more and give you some tools to take that apart and understand why this works for you. So probably we should start with the simplest one, which in my mind is plot, right? So shall I take a stab at
Yeah,
plot?
you,
And
you go
then
with plot.
you can elaborate on that, I think, because you're actually the narratologist of us, so you'll have more to say on this topic. Thumbs up.
We,
I don't know why I did that. But I will give my sort of understanding of plot first, and I do think it is the simplest of the three. It is simply the chain of events, the sequence of events in a story as told in the story. So whether it is chronological or not doesn't matter. If we're talking about plot, it's just the sequence of events as told in the story. So give an example that I'm familiar with that doesn't come from fantasy. A Rose for Emily by William Faulkner is
Mhm.
a story that starts with a funeral and then it goes back in time and then it kind of chronologically speaking, it shifts all over the place, gives us insights into the character. There's a reason. So when I say that plot is the simplest of this three, it doesn't mean it's not important. It's important. Why an author chooses to present the events in a certain sequence can really matter. It's actually a really interesting thing to talk about. Why does William Faulkner start with the end and then go back in time and then show us this and that? Well, if you read the story, you'll see, I'm not going to spoil it for anyone, but if you read the story, you'll see that he thereby preserves a sense of mystery. And he gives you a kind of a, whoa, that's what was going on in this story at the end of it because of the way he puts the story together in terms of the plot, giving us things out of chronological order. So that's an example. Or another example that would be familiar to many fantasy readers, and again, I'm not going to spoil it, but The Lies of Locke Lamora is a story where you have a sequence of events. Some of them are set in a present and some are flashbacks or in a past. What does Scott Lynch succeed in doing by giving us those things in that order? Well, you get to know the characters in the present first, but then you get insights into them in their past, and that will enrich and give you sort of a gradual understanding of, okay, where are these characters coming from? Why do they do this the way they do? So that's a reason why obviously Scott Lynch strategically wanted to present the events in this sequence and give the reader that growing understanding of, okay, here's where the characters are coming from. That's why plot and understanding, okay, trying to wrestle with, okay, why did the author do it like this in this sequence? That's why it matters. So,
Yeah,
yeah, would you agree with all that?
pretty much.
Okay.
I, and we're done. Thanks for watching, everyone. But so a couple more examples to try and illustrate this.
Yeah.
The film Memento.
Oh,
Christopher
brilliant. Yeah.
film
Yeah.
Memento. No, it's not just in reverse chronology. So it's not like people walking backwards,
Yeah.
but you have a sequence which is actually at the end of the, and each sort of scene takes you a step further back in time, a step further back in time, a step further back in time. That would be the plot. So the plot is told in that way.
Right.
If you reordered that into a chronological sequence, which you used to be able to do on the DVD, there was a little hidden extra, an Easter egg, that if you clicked
Oh,
at a certain point on the menu, when it came up and said Memento Mori, if you clicked on that at a certain point,
huh. Huh.
it played the entire film, but with all of the scenes now arranged chronologically. And if you do
Right.
that, you realize it's not actually that complicated of a story. The complication and a lot of the interest and intrigue in that film was because of how how those scenes were organized,
Uh-huh.
and that adds to the film that you're enjoying. You have it with one of your favorite authors, Mark Lawrence.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah.
that initial trilogy of the Prince of Thorns, the
Yeah, the Broken Empire trilogy. Yeah.
Broken Empire trilogy. And again, a lot of that is here's one time period, here's another time period, and they are intercut.
Yep.
And by doing that, it moves backwards and forwards between things, which again stimulates interest. So that is plot, the sequence of narrative events as they are narrated. That's what the plot is.
Good. Yeah.
And one of the common things that people quite often say, they go, "Oh, this doesn't have a plot," and you go, "That's odd." Now, authors out there will try and write things that don't have plot, like character studies, for instance, frequently don't have plot. A lot of
Mm.
literary fiction won't have narrative events. It will just be some sort of thought experiment or a character study or something like that. You can have literature that is not, that doesn't have plot, but the
Mm.
chances of finding mainstream fantasy or science fiction
Yeah.
that doesn't have plot, you're like, that is odd. There aren't any that immediately spring to mind because narrative events happen. And that's the big thing about plot as a concept. Plot is about the sequence of narrative events. What is a narrative event? It's when something happens, and that can be, if you look at Jane Austen, a conversation. That is a narrative event. Information is being revealed. Characterization is being revealed. It is something that is happening. It isn't necessarily action. Action is not synonymous with narrative event. An event is something that occurs that changes the reader understanding of the situation. Um, so that's one way of thinking about this. Um, so a classic example where we think about plot would be the film Highlander
Uh-huh.
because of those flashback sequences, what you would call analepsis. That would be the slightly more technical term for a flashback is analepsis.
Right.
And in that, it establishes Connor McLeod, played by Christopher Lambert, at Madison Square Garden watching a wrestling match.
Yep.
Then there's this whole fight in the garage, or the what is it? The parking lot? What is it called in America? Is
They
it
call it
garage?
parking lot.
Okay.
Yeah.
With so and they're fighting with swords, and you're going,
Or
but this.
parking garage. We could, it was a parking garage, I think, right? Yeah.
And of course, like this was meant to be, contemporary, as in it's meant to be at roughly the same time that the viewer is seeing
Right.
it.
Right.
Whereas we would now look at it and go, oh, but that happened a while ago. So again, viewer perception is a fascinating aspect of this. But they're fighting with swords. And so there's this really strange sequence where you go, why are they fighting with swords? And then suddenly there's an analeptic sequence, a flashback that takes us back to Conor MacLeod as a Highlander warrior in Scotland going off into battle. And it stimulates interest. Now, if we rearrange that all chronologically, you would have, it would start with him in the Highlands of Scotland, and then it would keep jumping forward in time until we got to the Madison Square Garden sequence. And
Right.
yeah, that would be chronological, but would it be as compelling? Would it create that sense of mystery? And so
Right.
we can see plot here is an important element in how it is being told. Just as when we take something that is in a chronological sequence, quite often it's because the author or the writer feels that telling it in that linear form, having a linear plot, is actually of benefit to the viewer, the reader, and builds on those things as we go through. They work in different ways to create interest and mystery and tension. And a really common element of this that we see in a lot of those action TV shows and things, where it starts with someone in dire straits, and it's like, and you might be wondering how I got here, and then 24 hours earlier. So what that does is it sets up something bad is going to happen, or this weird thing is going to happen. Then it jumps back 24 hours earlier and establishes this sense of normality and normalcy, that how did that character now end up in that? It creates the level of interest. And that's where plot is diverging from the next thing we're going to talk about, which is one of the ways of defining story.
Right. Right. I am genuinely wondering how you got here, AP.
Many years ago, my mom and dad shared a special kind of hug.
Oh, okay, okay. None of that, please. So story. I think that we've done a pretty good job of talking about plot, which again, I think is the simplest. I will give my understanding of story. And I think you have a slightly more expert level of understanding of this, but
But no, let me preface this by saying it's not a more expert understanding. Even
yeah,
within the field of literary analysis,
right,
there are different ways of approaching things and using terminology specifically with a slightly different definition.
right,
And that, it's not to say that the other definitions are wrong or this definition is more important. It's just, it's a different way of thinking about it. So
right.
we can have, like we said with plot, that people commonly use plot, story, and narrative interchangeably.
Interchangeably, yeah,
But depending on the specificity of the thing that you are doing, sometimes those definitions can shift and change.
right,
So I just wanted to say there, it's not that how I am using it is more expert. It's
yeah.
a different way of thinking about it. So
And the main point is it's useful to be able to understand these distinctions
yeah.
for anyone. So story is the way I would usually explain story to, say, my students in Intro to Literature or something, a course of that nature, would be that story. One element that can be included when you're talking about story is plot, but that it includes things like character development. When you're talking about the sequence of events as they are written, that's plot. But when you begin to talk about things like what the character's growth, what the character learned as a result of the experience, how they matured, how they changed, then you're talking about story. If you're talking about the themes, then you're talking about story. You've gone outside of that simple here's the sequence of events. So when you're talking about the character development and the themes, you may also talk about the setting as well. These are things that you may speak about and reorder the sequence so that it's chronological. I think that's a fairly typical thing, is that when you're talking about story, you're rearranging the sequence. And this has obvious value when you're talking about story versus plot. Now, again, plot, very valuable to understand. Okay, why did the author do it in this particular sequence? Obviously, when you're talking about character development, it speaks for itself. There's huge importance to that. That's something that many readers relate to. these days is what is the journey of the characters here, and that's when you're talking about the story, or the themes, which is something that you and I love talking about. That story, when you're getting to that level of discourse, as opposed to plot. So that's kind of how I come at story, and that's my understanding. But I think you have something to add to that as well.
Well, just to build on what you were saying there. So what a lot of that distills down to is meaning. What what does this narrative mean? Because as soon as we get involved in meaning, that's where we're dealing with story. Because story is revelatory.
Right.
It's a communication of various meanings, and we do that by understanding character arcs over time, uh, the events, the causal links between them, understanding what this is communicating. So a lot of that in an introduction to literature course and a lot of early literature sort of stuff that we do. When we think of story, it's the general meaning that is being communicated. And that will include a lot of stuff about character and theme and characterization, all those elements,
Right.
what that meaning is. But another way of thinking about story, and this comes from discussions of fabula and sujet, or story
Mm,
and discourse,
right.
which, if we think of plot as the sequence of narrative events as they are narrated to us, that story is that rearranging of it chronologically to
Mm,
lay out all of the events to make meaning more apparent. So story is actually that chronological sequence that makes it clear how A connects to B connects to C, and therefore make meaning and understanding more apparent. So story in a lot of respects is very like plot, except it's about the meaning, and we typically rearrange things chronologically
right.
because that makes meaning more apparent. So, as a shorthand, I would typically say plot is the sequence of events as narrated, story is the sequence of events arranged chronologically. But what you're
Good.
trying to derive from both these approaches
Right.
is slightly different.
Right.
Um, and again, it's not there. Even within all of these different disciplines, people use story in different ways. This is just, it helps us understand different approaches to analyzing it, because quite often when we read, we go, but all there is are the words on the page, and this is what was said, and it must mean this.
Mm,
And yet we can see that our minds, our imaginations are so flexible that we can start moving things around. And from moving things around, we see how elements can contrast with one another or create stronger comparisons, stronger links. And that is actually revelatory about what is happening within the text. And the text could be a film, a TV show, a book, a short story, a poem. It's about understanding what is being communicated and how it's being communicated. Because if
right.
we understand that, we can actually get more from the text that we love and enjoy. It's not necessarily about always wanting to be, say, a creative writer and going, I want to know how this thing is done.
Right.
Understanding a little bit about it allows you and helps you enjoy the thing even more. And that's part of the issue with our part of the issue that sometimes people have is they go, but I don't care about that. But this actually helps you enjoy your hobby, the thing that you're passionate about, even more because you understand it better.
And that's the point of this whole thing, really, is these are tools, these are things that you can talk about, to allow you to articulate, and make clearer, I think, in the process, what it is that you're loving about the story, and being able to say, here's the plot. And it's interesting that the author chose to chain everything together this particular way because it allows this revelation to happen. And then you get to talk about the story. And the point of talking about the story in the manner in which we were describing is to understand the characters and the themes on a deeper level, to be able to articulate that, and to hopefully, have that be more enriching, as you in the process. Now, there's another element that we need to talk about here, which is narrative. And I'm going to let you start this one off because, I think you'll be able to articulate this better than I can. But narrative, how does that differ from plot and from story? What is narrative?
narrative is made up of a sequence of a sequence of events that are causally linked
Mm,
and are experienced by characters usually within a setting.
yeah.
That would
Okay.
be like the broad sort of general concept that we have narrative events occur. These narrative events are experienced by a character or characters, and these events occur in a setting. Like that would be the broad general sort of concept of narrative. And you can see why I kind of default to narrative all the time. Instead of talking about, oh, I was reading this story, because in my head, story is a more specific thing. Narrative is the general thing. Narrative is what a lot of us, we typically refer to. It's the story, it's the book, the novel, whatever we go. But that is typically narrative, a sequence of causally linked events.
Yeah.
Those events are experienced by characters, and those characters are generally experiencing them within a setting.
Okay. Let's break that down a little bit. Causally linked. Why is that particular part of this definition important, and how does that distinguish it from story and or plot?
Okay, so one of the reasons we stress causal linkages, if let's give a broad example of this. I went to the shops. Aliens landed in New York. A fish died in a lake. There's three narrative events. There is no linkage between them. There's no narrative there. That these
Right.
are just events. There's no link between them to tie them together to communicate something. It's just three random events. But if I went to the shops, I buy some food, I came home and was in a car accident on the way home. Suddenly you see that going to the shop, getting the food, then coming home, that it's describing a sequence of events that are all linked together, that connect.
Right.
And that connection is important for what narrative is. Now, all of this comes with a massive sort of coda to it, which is
Uh-huh.
authors are sneaky, and authors will remove elements, they will play with elements. Think of it as narrative as a giant Jenga tower,
Hmm.
and it'll have these causally linked events, it'll have these characters, it'll have this setting. But authors sometimes remove little pieces here and there, and it's still a Jenga tower, even though they have now removed these pieces.
Yeah.
But if they remove the wrong piece, the Jenga tower collapses, and it's no
Yeah.
longer narrative. It's just a pile of bricks.
Right.
That's kind of what we're getting. So the causal linkage doesn't necessarily have to be overt. If you think of Sherwood Anderson's very famous sort of mosaic novel, Winesburg, Ohio, that is a series of apparently disconnected short stories all tied together by them occurring in a location. But from that, the linkages that we place as reader, they are not written in the text, but we link them together because we see how these different characters interact, and when taken together with our interpretation, create
Mm.
a narrative. But that is external to what is happening in the text. We actually create the narrative in our own minds because we look at how these different mosaic pieces, when we put them all together, we get a new picture. And that new picture is actually a narrative of a sequence of narrative events, that we understand why characters are acting in certain ways and why something that happens in one story actually impacts a different story.
Is it worth talking about diegetic levels at this point? Because you were kind of, I mean, it's relevant to what you were just talking about, at least, right?
Why don't we finish talking about the narrative elements first before we go into
Yeah.
diegetic level?
Yeah. Okay. So that's the causally linked part and experienced by the characters within a setting. Any other aspects of that definition that would be good to highlight?
Well, and obviously, like by characters, we mean it doesn't necessarily have to be a human. It
Right.
doesn't have to be humanoid. It can be a focus, a point of view. But
Okay.
and again, it's because authors like to play with these things, and they aren't writing to formula. They aren't going, I must have. It's understanding how all of these bricks interlink and finding a way to build their own unique Jenga tower out of it.
Right.
Setting, I think, we can deal more with setting and world building in a separate video, but
We'll do
setting
that
essentially
later.
is
Yeah.
where the characters are standing. And one of the minor distinctions we can make is setting is typically where the scene is occurring.
Right.
Um, but that's all I would kind of say about that. So narrative is basically all of those different elements like character, setting, scene, the world building, uh, characterization, tone, all of those things that go together that create the causal links between narrative events that we then interpret and ascribe meaning to.
And that's narrative. Okay. Cool.
Does
So
that kind of
those
make
are the,
sense?
oh yeah, definitely. So we've got plot defined and story defined and narrative defined. So good. Mission accomplished. Do we want to
Or
say anything further on this, or
will we have a brief foray into diegetic levels? I don't normally do this, but Philip just asked me in the video about diegetic levels. The explanation I gave there was not clear enough, and I don't think it's helpful. So what I will do is at a later date, Philip and I will sit down and we will have a discussion about the diegesis and hyperdiegetic and hypodiegetic and extradiegetic. We will talk about all of these things and we will do it just in one video because I think it is too complex for the very cursory, generalized, and I will have to admit, inaccurate way that I was conflating things to try and simplify them. So I apologize. There is a chunk of this video missing. There's a chunk of the discussion missing. I will do it at a later date. Sorry about that. But again, it's that sort of, you start getting into the nuances and playfulness of, we are trying to use terms to codify concepts and this different approach to art that is all about different forms of expression and different techniques. And we coin one term and we go, oh, that's the term for this. And then someone goes, yeah, but that's slightly different to that thing. So, oh, we need another term. The coining of the term, these definitions, that is far less important than understanding that it isn't just, well, the thing said this. And there are lots of very enjoyable narratives that are very direct and function perfectly well, perfectly entertainingly, perfectly interesting.
mm-hmm.
But there's such a breadth and variety to what narrative does.
Yeah. I mean, and these tactics influence how we experience a story. So, for example, I mentioned breaking the fourth wall, The Hobbit. That happens quite a few times in The Hobbit, where suddenly the narrator says, and if that were you in this situation, or something like that, and that's a thing that you'd see more often in children's stories. And so it affects the overall tone of the storytelling there in that particular example. But these are things that influence how we interact with the story at hand in some very interesting ways, I think. So,
And like that example you just gave, that's a perfect example of using a technique to encourage audience interaction and engagement. Because
mhm,
small children, if they think they're being directly addressed by the story, it makes it more special. They can be more engaged
right,
in it. Whereas we would go, what? Why? Stop doing that. Like I'm much more interested in viewing what is happening as an
right,
immersive experience.
right,
But we are not always the intended audience. We are not always the best audience. We're not always the audience for that book. And what we want, what our preferences are, what we desire, is not necessarily representative of what should be done or what everyone does or what everyone wants. That we recognize this. We're all individuals. We all have different preferences, biases, and desires. We
right.
all enjoy different things. So projecting onto you should never do this. Well, why? Well, readers don't like it. All readers?
Right.
I'd be very interested to see the research that backs that up. And that's because, as is perfectly natural, we assume that how we perceive it, how we think about it, is the right way to do it. Because otherwise, that we would think about it in a different way. We wouldn't deliberately try to think about it in a wrong. We think it's normal and natural and the way that we do it. But we also know that we're all individuals, that we all have different perceptions and all of these things.
Yeah.
And what we have to do is reconcile, okay, this may not appeal to me, but would it appeal to someone else? And understanding all of these different elements of narrative that we're going to be discussing helps us understand how someone else who reads in a different way or is looking for different things, how they could potentially like and enjoy something that we don't. And
Right.
we can isolate those aspects. And we'll get into it with characterization and
Yep.
implied or overt characterization, like all of these different things.
Yep.
So that's kind of the overview of plot and narrative and story. And people listening will notice that I slipped into using story. I tell you a story. Like in
Mm-hmm.
formal conversation, we do that. But when we're trying to think about it, when we're trying to analyze it, that's why thinking about it more in terms of narrative and
Right.
then using story more specifically and using plot more specifically. Because the clearer we are with that communication, the less misunderstanding there is. But we're having a chat, we're having a conversation. This is
Right.
not scripted. Therefore, it's not a whole sequence of, I must say it this way all the way down. Like, this genuinely how we talk about narrative.
Yep. Well, next, you mentioned earlier focalization, and that's going to come up in our next discussion, which is going to be on my channel about narrative perspective. So that's going to be a fun one, I think. And then the different kinds of narrators that you can identify and why that matters. We're going to discuss uh, various approaches that authors can take when deciding, okay, I'm going to have a first person narrator who's going to be a major character or a minor character, and how does that affect the story? What if the story were told from this other character's perspective? How would that affect the story? Would it be a different story entirely? That's going to be fun. I'm looking forward to that. So that'll be next in our series. But this was a ton of fun, and we got a diegetic bonus today. So Anna, that was really nice.
Well, Philip, thank you very much for joining me. I hope people get something out of it. This is not telling people you must do this,
Right.
but we love literature. We love storytelling. We love tales. And we've spent a lot of time studying and thinking about this, reading what other people think about it and the different approaches they've had. We've had that opportunity. And it seems selfish and curlish to deny sharing that with other people. If
Yeah.
people don't want to do all these things, no one is saying that you have to. But hopefully this reveals that there's more than one way to approach all of this stuff, that
Right.
it's not set in stone. And B, if you if you want to delve deeper into this, if you want to refine and develop these things, because initially when you do this stuff, it's awkward and difficult, and you have to put a lot of time and effort into it and practice it. But it's the same as driving a car. The very first time that you try to do it, it's complicated, and well, I'm looking at these mirrors, and then there's traffic, and well, obviously over here you don't have to use your gear shift because it's automatic. But
Most guys are. Yeah.
it's complicated, and yet with more practice, suddenly it becomes second nature, and the actual task you are doing has not changed in level of difficulty. Your command and ability to do it has changed as you become more skillful. The level of difficulty has remained exactly the same. Driving the car is not easier now. It's exactly the same. It's the same mechanical things that you have always had to do. You're just now more practiced at it. And suddenly you're doing a lot of the things automatically. As you're driving, suddenly your peripheral vision, you're checking, oh, that car's going to pass there. You've flicked your eyes up to double check your rear view mirror. You're signaling before you pull into the lane if you're an actual proper driver and not someone driving in Florida. Um, although I hear the New Jersey Turnpike is similar.
Oh man, Florida is a piece of cake. You don't want to come to Jersey, man. So.
That sounds like a threat. You don't want to come to Jersey. I'll sick the boys on you.
Uh,
But with all of these things, You don't have to do it if you don't want to. But just like learning to swim, and you're doing the doggy paddle. I'm fine with the doggy paddle. Yeah, okay. Here's a whole load of other techniques that you can learn if you want. Well, why are you saying I need to do front crawl? We're not. But if you learn to do front crawl, you'll move faster. It'll be easier. You will use less energy. You'll become a better swimmer. You might enjoy swimming more if you develop the additional techniques. But no one is forcing you to.
Nope.
But thank you very much for joining me, Philip. I greatly appreciate it.
Oh, what a pleasure.
And for those of you still watching, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.